Hi, Paige. Jared here. Thank you for your weekly reflection email, and thank you again for having me into your classroom on Friday afternoon. I want to just touch on a couple of things from your email first, and then we'll go ahead and get into that lesson plan or my observation from Friday. You note conferences, and I think this is a great experience. I'm glad as part of your student teaching you were able to experience conferences in some manner because what you speak of is unfortunately the truth more often than not, in that the students who you really want to see, desperately see their parents, are oftentimes the ones that you don't see at conferences. And then the ones that you don't really feel like you need to see because the student's doing fine academically and socially and emotionally, those are the ones that kind of line up to visit with you. And so, I encourage you to think about the role that conferences will play in your own classroom once you're a professional teacher. Because I used to see it as the one time I communicated with parents throughout the school year or the two times that I communicated with them. But I think more increasingly now, what I would advocate for students is that through phone conversations, through emails, and things like that, I think you're able to communicate with parents, especially those who aren't able to be there with you for conferences. And I think conferences are just a nice opportunity to put a name and a face together and meet people personally. But for those students in particular who are having struggles, my question would be, have you contacted them on the phone? Have you emailed them? Have you reached out to them in other ways to try to bring them in to their student school experience, recognizing that if you're able to partner with them, and then the student is also able to partner together, the experience is going to be much better. Right? If you think of a stool with three legs, the teacher is one, the school is one of those, the student is one of those legs, and then the parents also need to be a part of that. So they are a part of this equation, and I know that it can be a little bit daunting to make those phone calls. But I would ask Justin about that, and I would see if there's an opportunity for you to maybe reach out in that way and stretch yourself out of your comfort zone just a little bit in order to try to communicate with some of those parents. And what I find is most often, if I'm showing concern about their student and I'm conveying that I want to help their student succeed, parents are pretty quick to jump on board and be a part of that experience as well. I'm going to go ahead and kind of fast forward to your lesson from Friday, and I'm going to attach this document, and like I said, I recommend that you would just print this out and that you would just add this to tab 3 of your notebook, your residency binder, and that's where all the evaluation stuff goes, just so that you have it and you can show that you've gone through some of this. And so I write quite a bit, and that's what I do while I'm observing, and I just ask questions. And the other thing that I do is I note times, and this is just a habit I got into because I often find when I'm teaching, I lose track of time. And so I figure if I'm suffering from that, other people might be too. And so I just start a timer, and then whenever there's kind of a shift in the lesson, I'll just note that. And so, for example, I started the timer as the bell rang 1 minute and 30 seconds in. You began reviewing previous material in the class. And so students were answering questions that you had. And then at about 3 minutes in, so that took about a minute and a half, 3 minutes in, you began dividing students into reading groups. And then at 4 minutes, you actually began reading. And so that just gives you a sense of how your lesson flowed, and maybe some areas you could maybe cut something out or maybe pick up the speed of something, so on and so forth. I pose a lot of questions throughout this. Those are usually bolded. Don't feel like you necessarily have to answer all of them in your weekly reflection, but I do think that there are just important things you might want to consider. And so I begin with some of these highlights. The first is that without any direction from you that I noticed, students who didn't have textbooks went over to the side of the classroom, grabbed their textbooks, seemed to figure out which page they needed to be in. And this showed me that, hey, you and Justin have established these routines. Students know what's expected, and there's power in that because they didn't have to ask you helplessly, I don't have a book, I can't participate. They knew that the expectation was go get one, find the page, look at your neighbor's page, whatever, and get to where you need to be. And I think that's really important, and it's powerful, and it's something you want to consider as you begin a school year next year. How are you going to establish these routines? Which routines are going to be important? Otherwise, you're going to have students who A, ask you what to do every time you don't explain it, or B, they're just not going to do anything. And they're going to be sitting there without a book, not paying attention, not following along, because that routine hasn't been established. As we move into the actual reading, your reading for Friday was pretty limited in that Romeo and Juliet were really the only two characters engaging in the reading. And so you had two students reading, one for Romeo, one for Juliet. With 21 students in the classroom, this leaves about 18 or 19 students who are not really participating in the reading. And my question is just basically, is that what you want? I mean, I understand that they're following along ideally as the reading is happening, but might you find a different way to encourage more students to actually read aloud and participate that way? The second major question that I had during this was that I didn't necessarily hear you tell students what the expectation was during the reading. So I was unsure if there was a study guide or a graphic organizer or something that students were supposed to be doing while the reading was happening. Maybe I missed that. But if I didn't, then my question is, what's the expectation of students during those 4 minutes of reading and then another 4 minutes of reading? Do we expect freshman students to just follow along and pay attention rather than giving them something that they actually need to complete while you go through that? During the conversation time, I noticed you moving around and kind of mingling with each group. I think that's wonderful. Don't be afraid to get away from the desk and be one with the people, right? The proximity helps kind of keep student behaviors in line, and then it also gives you an opportunity to engage with all the students. I would just encourage you to make sure that you're giving equal time to every single group rather than just kind of gravitating toward your favorite groups of students. I'm not saying that you did that, but that's kind of my first reaction, is just kind of go to the students that I know are doing what they need to be doing, just to make sure that that's equitable for students as they move along. About 17 and a half minutes in, you were asking a question for the whole group, and you called out Serenity, and you said, Serenity should totally share. I'm just putting you on the spot because you never share. I want you to be careful with that for a couple of reasons. My guess is that you know Serenity a little bit. You've established a relationship with her. But even though that might be the case, just be careful about singling students out in any way that then if she didn't want to participate, that would make her feel bad about it. Maybe speak to her beforehand, personally, privately, and say, hey, I haven't heard you speak for a while. Would you be willing to share with the group? I would imagine this is kind of just an off-the-cuff kind of thing. You just saw Serenity, you were in kind of a playful mood, and you wanted to get her to speak up. Just be aware that might actually deter some students from participation within a discussion if they felt ill-prepared or they thought that maybe you were picking on them in some kind of way. Just something to be aware of. Again, I note great proximity or use of movement around the classroom. The other thing I just wanted to note down here is just there was a point at which you were moving around the classroom and you had said to me that these are advanced students and they'll get the work done. I think I had asked you about why 5 or 6 students had left halfway through the period. And I've heard you allude to your students by virtue of being advanced or being general ed a couple of times. And I just want to caution you with regard to that as well, because we develop stereotypes about certain groups of students that aren't always fitting. And I've had the privilege of teaching high ability and advanced learners, and I've also had the privilege of teaching students who are below proficiency. And one of the things that I found with both of them is that you give them an inch and they'll take a yard. And all students, because they're 14 or 15, need to be held accountable. And you need to establish those standards and expectations for them. And so I just caution you in your speech, in conversations with other teachers and the students themselves, to avoid labels like advanced or high ability or lower or general or whatever. And then also just to avoid stereotyping students as because they're advanced, they're going to do all of these things and you don't really need to give them any accountability. Because that's probably not the case. And even though they're advanced, you want to encourage them and push them to become even better than they already are. You need to offer them enrichment activities that challenge them at the appropriate level, rather than just having them sort of breeze through school because everything's kind of at this it's low level hanging fruit, and they're able to grab all of it because they happen to be more advanced in reading and writing. We want to continue pushing them forward so that they are able to continue to challenge themselves and grow. And then I think probably the area that we talked about a little bit after your lesson had finished, the area that I encourage you to really think a little bit more strategically about for your next lesson plan would be the final half of the class period, the closure, the way that we wrap all of this up. Because your first half was extremely well paced. I mean, even the amount of time you had students reading, and then they were in small group discussions, and there's whole group discussion, and then reading again, all of that was paced very, very well. And you can see where I hit the time marks up there. And it's about, every 4 or 5 minutes, something new is happening. And then we kind of get to that halfway point, and you note that, okay, from 27.5 to 34.5, not a lot going on. Okay, students are presumably answering questions in a study guide. They're doing this reflection about a mentor, whatever the case is. And I noticed, especially at 40 minutes, the noise level really, really increased. And that's not always a sign that students are off task, but it's also not necessarily a sign that they're on task. And so my question would be, how do you keep the focus on learning? How do you put all of the assignments up on the board so that students know directly, what do I do next? What do I do next? And then how do you check in with all of them? I think these are just important conversations to consider. I did note, as I was not trying to look at every student, but I did just note from my vantage point in the back of the classroom, there was a student playing chess on the computer. It seemed to me that you saw that. It didn't say anything about it. So the question then is, well, if you don't say anything, you don't tell them to get focused on work, then are you allowing it by not saying anything? By not reprimanding him for that. And then I also noticed a couple of other student groups where it seemed like games were occurring on the screen rather than the work. Again, I recognize it was Friday. I recognize it was a long, grueling week with conferences. It was a 4-day weekend ahead. But that is something that sheet that I gave to you asks me directly, was there a focus on learning throughout the entire period? I don't know if there necessarily was, because I saw so many students on games and other types of things. And then I didn't necessarily see the closure to wrap the whole lesson up. But again, I think, Paige, for a first lesson, first time on your own, second week of school, I think your lesson was by and large really, really great. And so please don't be discouraged by the comments that I give you. Again, I'm not trying to judge you in any way, but I am trying to ask some questions that hopefully can guide you as you think through what you might do for lesson planning in weeks to come. I encourage you once again to get to know those students' names, because those names really do have value and are important, and they can help you create equity as you're calling on various students throughout the class period. The final thing that I offer to you are just some questions you might want to consider in your reflection. And then I usually do this. I usually type out how many long lesson plans I've seen, how many co-teaching lesson plans I see in the notebook, and those types of things. And so my encouragement for you is to finish tab 1 in the notebook and to begin creating the other tabs as well, because the next time that I come in, I need to see some growth in this area, and I also need to see some more stuff so I can actually assess it. I have to assess it 3 times throughout the course of your student teaching. So other than that, thank you again for having me in. I do see a lot of wonderful things that are coming out in your teaching, and I know that it was just the first experience for you. So feel free to respond to me, respond to this video, ask questions, ask clarifications, and I look forward to seeing you on Wednesday night as well. Okay. Take care, Paige.